office, so this is great news. My memory is B and F, ENV200 B and F, don't have rooms in this building, but for pretty much all the other streams, I believe they're all in this building somewhere. And in particular, in my section, the ethical thought and moral values section, we will be in B12, which is, I guess, in the basement of this building. I've never actually been there before. So can everyone hear me okay without a mic? Please raise your hand if you have any problem. Just get my attention if you can't hear me. I like to move around. I don't like to use a mic, so this is the way I like to talk. Okay. Actually, on that note, it's worth saying a quick thing about ethics and morality. So you might have heard these two terms and might not know what the difference is. For the purposes of this course, and in particular this stream of this course, we're going to use those terms to mean exactly the same thing. We're not going to say that ethics and morality are different things. You can use those terms the same way. And the reason we're doing that is because, broadly speaking, among contemporary philosophers, those terms are used synonymously. So that's sort of in keeping with most of the discourse in this particular field. Okay. So welcome to Lecture 4. This is the introduction to ethics. And we can see that when we're thinking about ethical theory in the context of the environmental nexus, there's a lot of different kinds of structures and questions that might be helpful, guiding our readings, guiding our understanding of the different philosophers and the different principles they're going to suggest. And part of what I want to do in this lecture is give you these structures so that you can apply them. And that means that when I give you these structures, they're going to sound pretty abstract and perhaps maybe a little hard to follow at the beginning, but hopefully as you use them throughout the course, they'll become more natural and less abstract. Okay, so I'm going to start with the learning goals. And I'm going to use the learning goals as sort of a structure for the presentation so you can follow along and recognize sort of where we are. And you can also see they're also at the top, so it should be easy to follow. Okay, so the first question, as I said in the introduction, is what do philosophers do? What do moral philosophers do? And that might be something that's not obvious, especially if you've not taken any philosophy, which many of you may not have. Very rarely do high schools offer this. And especially if you've never read philosophical texts, which are a little bit different in style than other kinds of texts. And we have a pretty good idea of what arts and humanities do. We look at texts, broadly speaking, and we try to figure out how those texts convey meaning, how they elicit emotional responses. But when we're thinking about natural scientists and social scientists, we also have a pretty good idea of what that means. That means we're looking at data, and we're trying to empirically observe things in the world. And either that data gives us hypotheses, or it helps to either refute hypotheses, or sometimes we see if it's consistent with various hypotheses. But what do moral philosophers do? And what does it mean for a moral philosophy to be a good moral philosophy or a plausible moral philosophy? That's the structure I want to give you right at the beginning. Okay, so the next thing is we're going to apply this to the reading. And this week's, or this session's reading was Routley's plea for environmental ethics, for a new kind of ethics that was not so anthropocentric, not so focused on humans. And in particular, I want to take this text apart. Again, many of you may not have come across philosophical texts like this before, and see how the argument works. And in particular, how counterexamples are used in this argument to give a structure and to motivate the conclusions that Routley wants to endorse. Okay, so then we're going to do something that's very common in one of these intro to ethics, which is provide you some of the broad, influential categories of moral theory. And there are three sort of main categories of moral theory. And I'm also going to give you sort of a bonus half because I'm generous like that. And then in the fourth part, we're going to talk about what it is to be morally considerable. And so here we're going to talk about when we're thinking about the moral community, the community of individuals that are important in our moral decision making, who or what should belong there and why. So this is a lot to get through, and the idea here is that I want to give you these structures because they'll keep recurring throughout the course. And that means that if you get them now, they may not make so much sense, but hopefully they'll be reinforced as we go through. Okay, so what is a good moral philosopher? What does a good moral philosopher do? What is a moral theory? How do we know if we should accept a moral theory as opposed to another one? So broadly speaking, moral philosophers develop theories. And a theory is a set of judgments, propositions, claims, principles. We don't need to worry about the differences between these things. But broadly speaking, these are, we'll just call them principles, broadly speaking. These are rules that help you govern, what you ought to do or what individuals or groups ought to do in given circumstances. Now, sometimes these principles will be very broad. They'll apply to a very large number of cases, and sometimes they'll be much more narrow. Now, I've just started, and already there would be moral philosophers that would disagree with me. So one of the things moral philosophers are very good at, we're trained to do, is disagree with each other. And in particular, some moral philosophers would already say that the correct theories are sort of anti-theories, or not even theories at all. They don't have principles that give you guidance. And that's because morality is complex, and every situation is new, and it has to be developed and evaluated on its own terms. So pretty much everything I'm going to say, there's someone out there who disagrees with that. So I just want to flag that this is a broad, common way of thinking about what moral philosophers do, but it's not necessarily going to be agreed upon by everyone. Okay, but what do we do with these theories? So once we have these principles have implications, and good philosophers draw out the implications, both for theory and practice. So to give a very concrete, simple example, if your theory tells you you ought not to lie, and your partner asks you, how does this outfit look on me? It might not be in your self-interest to say the truth, but there's a practical implication of this moral theory which tells you that you ought not to lie, and that's resistant to what your personal inclinations are or the personal reasons for either following what you morally ought to do or not. The less obvious one is theoretical implications. So this is sometimes overlooked, even by moral philosophers. When you have a theory, that has implications for certain concepts that might not be moral concepts. So here's an example. Let's suppose your moral theory says what you morally ought to do is what's accepted by your group or your community or some other relevant social grouping. If that's the case, then you have to have some theoretical notion of what a group is, what a norm is, how it develops, when it's in force, when it's not in force, and so forth. So even though this theory is quite simple and normative, it gives you all of these implications for these other concepts which may not be normative or may not be obviously normative, we might say. So it gives you theoretical and practical implications. Okay, so what do we have? So the different philosophers have these different theories, which are these sets of principles, and these sets of implications. So we can sort of think of these as baskets of theories. And once you have these, we sort of test them against what we call intuitions. And intuitions are pre-theoretical notions of the target of what we're interested in. So here it's notions about what we morally ought to do or what's permissible or obligatory. And here, once we have these intuitions, we can test whether that basket of theories, that theory basket is more plausible than this theory basket, maybe because its implications are more plausible or because the principles have theoretical virtues. Maybe they're simple or they're broad or they're easy to understand. These sorts of things might give it strength over another. And then you get into very difficult questions about how to compare the theories. But already I've given you a picture of what it is to be to do moral philosophical theorizing, which doesn't indicate exactly how you should decide, but it does give you a structure for understanding how philosophers adjudicate between different theories. Okay, so again, that's probably going to sound pretty vague, but I'm going to keep applying it until hopefully it sticks. So if you have this basket of theories, I've just given you a theory of what moral philosophers do. And I've told you that when philosophers have a theory, they like to draw implications. So I'm going to draw implications of my own theory. One thing philosophers also like doing is being meta. So this is my attempt to be meta. So this theory suggests that there are ways of being a moral philosophy expert, or there are ways of being more expert as a moral philosopher. So what do philosophers do? Well, they develop theories and sets of principles, and then they draw implications. Both of these are skills that can be developed. And a good moral philosopher knows about the potentially true moral theories and can draw what we would call in logic the valid implications of those theories, the logically inferable implications of those theories. And as another small implication, you'll notice that this form of moral philosophy expertise allows for what we call intersubjective validation of expertise. If a moral philosopher recognizes that another moral philosopher does know about the potentially true moral theories and is able to, in new and interesting ways, draw implications of those moral theories, then that's something that they can recognize even if they don't actually agree with the theory in question. Okay, here's another thing that implies. So unlike some other domains of human knowledge and human understanding, this does not appeal to any notion of authority. So philosophers are trying to look at these ideas, these arguments, and these inferences without thinking about who said them or even why they said them. And although philosophers are human, so we often fail to do this, at our best, we try to consider those ideas just in themselves. So that means that we don't have sort of sacred texts, we don't have privileged people, except people who are good at the sort of skills that I said. And that's something that's supposed to be somewhat democratic. Finally, it's worth saying that some people say that philosophy is all about your opinions. And the way that I've structured this, hopefully it's clear that it's not just about opinions, which are sort of unjustified views. Here, the question is, what are the theories, what are the principles, and how do they fit with the implications, both for theory and practice? Okay, so I've gone on about this quite a lot, and again, it might seem very abstract, but hopefully it'll be a good structure for you to understand the text as we go through. And one more piece of philosophical jargon. What I've described is something that the Harvard professor John Rawls called reflective equilibrium. And it's reflective in that what you're doing is you're taking these principles and these implications and you're considering them sort of theoretically, you're considering them in a calm mood when you have enough time and so forth. And it's equilibrium because you can adjust these implications and which principles you want to introduce into your theory in order to generate a mutually cohesive, coherent, and self-reinforcing equilibrium project. And again, moral philosophers like to disagree. And here, it's worth flagging that there's actually a very influential philosopher at our own institution, Peter Singer, who has argued that reflective equilibrium is not the best process. So even though this is a process that many moral philosophers would endorse, there are, again, many dissenters. No matter what you say in philosophy, someone is out there who's going to disagree with you. But this structure is something that many philosophers would agree with, and also I think it gives you a good sense of what this is. Okay. So that was a whole bunch of theoretical background, and now we want to put it into practice. So hopefully you read the Routley text, and the Routley text is this attempt to try to argue for going beyond our anthropocentric, our human-focused notions of ethics that was true historically speaking. And here we see an explicit implication or version of exactly what I'm arguing. So Routley considers a principle, and this principle he calls basic chauvinism or basic human chauvinism. And we can already see from the name, chauvinism means that putting something above another, and usually it has the implication of it being unjustified, that he's not going to endorse this principle. But nothing I said before says that moral philosophers that are good are only considering principles that they endorse. In this case, Routley is going to consider the implications of a principle that he doesn't endorse. Okay, so this principle, he sometimes also calls it freedom, is one should be able to do what one wishes, provided that there's no harm to either the self or to others. And we're going back to 1973, which is a little bit before your time and a little bit before my time. But in 1973, all of the sort of thoughts about animal rights and animal welfare that you may have heard of, this was mostly non-existent. This mostly came in the 80s. In the 60s, we had concern about some megafauna. We had things like the International Whaling Commission trying to protect some large species. But this was all quite new. The idea of thinking about the environment as valuable itself and other species as valuable. So when Routley said this, most of the people, and certainly all of the philosophers who would have heard this, would have been thinking about others as human beings only, and not about other living beings. So again, what do philosophers do? They take these principles and they draw out implications. And that's what Routley does. Routley draws out a particular set of implications, which I'm going to call the last people counterexamples. And counterexamples are a special kind of implication. they're implications that we think intuitively should be rejected. And if there's a theory or principle that grounds a particular implication, and that implication seems like it should be rejected, then that gives us reason to, or grounds to, reject or at least question the underlying theory or principle. And that's what Routley wants to do. So Routley says, if we accept this principle of basic human chauvinism, then we're committed to several, he thinks we're committed to several implications. So the first one is what we're calling the last person. By the way, in that not so charming 1970s sexist way, he says the last man, but I'm not going to say that because that's bad. So we're going to talk about the last person. So you have this last person, and this last person is planning to destroy all of, I don't know, the natural world or every other species. And it seems like, according to the basic human chauvinist principle, this is not going to be problematic in any way. He's not harming himself. He's not harming others insofar as we think of others as human beings. And so it seems like there's, morally speaking, nothing wrong or no reason to avoid doing so. Here's another implication that Routley claims follows from this principle. He says that this would be the case even if we generalize it to a whole final generation of people. So we have these last people, perhaps they're sterile, so they'll know there'll be no other people. And they're thinking about how to treat the environment, and they decide that they're going to, again, destroy the environment in some wanton way, let's say. And he says, you might be thinking that what's wrong with this intuitively is that these people are intentionally or directly destroying other creatures. He says, maybe the defender of the basic human chauvinist principle would say, well, what if it was a byproduct or a side effect of other activities which were beneficial? So he says, let's consider the great entrepreneur. And the great entrepreneur is someone who, in the way of making marketable products and services, incidentally, or as a side effect, generates harm to the environment. And according to basic human chauvinism, Routley says, again, this is not going to be a problem. And then we can, again, generalize this from the great entrepreneur to the industrial society, which is made up of great entrepreneurs. Hopefully, at this point, you see what he's trying to push at. And then, of course, it makes it a little bit clearer when you get to the vanishing species. He says, without an appropriate environmental economics, the majestic whale, let's say, the pieces of that whale might be more valuable cut up and used in terms of various marketable products than part of the living being out in the ocean. And he says that if we consider this vanishing species, it looks like the relentless marketplace logic is going to have us destroying the environment because we don't put a price or a value on the species themselves and their natural habitat, let's say. So we'll get into that more as we go through the other track, the social analysis track. But this is a thing that was pretty unusual to be saying in the 70s. Okay, so get out your clickers. I'm going to do my first clicker question. And what I want you to be thinking about is, what is this? What is the implications that Routley's looking at? Are these counterexamples really counterexamples? So my first question is, and let's start this, is do the last people do something wrong? And I've given you 4 answers. And the first is that, no, they don't do something wrong as long as the people get enough value out of it. The second is they do something wrong because there are rules, moral rules about what you ought to do, and killing other beings is part of it. Yes, they do something wrong because it reveals something about their character or their motivations, and that's something that is bad and reveals what makes it wrong, even though it's not about harming others. Or the fourth focuses on the objects themselves, those species and ecosystems, and says it's wrong because those systems have value themselves, and they're sort of morally considerable in some sense. Okay, so I will stop it there, and let's see what we've got. We've got a winner in the front row. So the last one, oh, I should probably move it out of the way a bit. So the last one is 4. So the last one is you should not destroy ecosystems. And a couple of people also voted E. I'm assuming that means none of the above. They thought that there was a different reason, perhaps, that it was wrong, and I would be very interested in hearing those. But I'll quickly say something about the group response. So I had a hidden agenda in giving these answers, and that is that these are, broadly speaking, reflective of certain foci in the moral universe and drawing attention to different things. So since it's the largest group, I wanted to hear someone who said 4 and why they said 4. Please. Oh, sorry, there's a mic coming.
I feel like saying that you should not destroy ecosystems is encompassing of the first 3, or maybe not the first 3, but as it's encompassing of 2 and 3, because if you're saying it's wrong as a rule to kill others, then that implies that it's also wrong to destroy ecosystems. And for the third one, if we're considering destroying the environment as not really bad, I just think it's all.
So the idea from the front, in case you didn't hear it, is that the 4th answer somehow is consistent with or encompasses the other responses, or at least 2 and 3. So the idea here is that if you shouldn't destroy ecosystem, then that sort of covers not having damage to other living beings, maybe, or if you shouldn't do it, then it reveals something bad about them as people. If anyone's open to it, I would really like to hear one of the E answers. Does someone say why they didn't answer one of these 4? Or was it an accident? I'll take that as it was an accident. OK, so E is all of the above. Before I go on to discuss a little bit about why these are, how these reflect the dominant theories, I do want to say that yes, there's a sense in which 4 is somehow compatible potentially with the others, or at least 2 and 3. And that's why, if you notice, I have 3.5 moral theories. This 4th one sort of reflects half a moral theory because it's sort of compatible with the other ones. So that's very apropos. OK, so when we're reflecting on these examples, I gave you whether this counterexample is really a counterexample, whether we should reject it. And I want to give you 2 more questions that would sort of make you think like a philosopher. So a philosopher, if they were presented with this, would say, you've given us this principle, and you've given us these implications, and you say they're counterexamples. The first question is, can I avoid those counterexamples? You say that they follow from the principle, but philosophers are very skeptical, and they do not like to be told what is true. So in particular, they might say, can we avoid these implications? So here's an example of a way they might say that. They might say, when we're considering this last generation, if this last generation destroys some other animal species, let's say, it might be that they're not harming themselves or others, or at least not directly, but perhaps some of the last generation has aesthetic enjoyment, let's say, of watching lions in the Serengeti and going on safari. And so they suffer indirectly. Maybe they're harmed indirectly by being less well off than they would have been if those resources were available. And in that sense, maybe the human chauvinist is still compatible with saying that they shouldn't kill, the last generation shouldn't kill. So that's a way that a philosopher might try to avoid that counterexample. They might try to break the link between the principle and the implications. And here's another thing a philosopher might say. They might say, oh yes, you've shown us that there are these implications of the theory, but are they so bad? You say they're counterexample, and you say that they're like things that we should reject, but maybe not. So maybe a philosopher might say, well, we call this principle freedom because it gives us so much scope for action, because we can do all these things that as long as they don't harm other human beings, because it's fine if we harm others. And you might think that it's morally really important that humans are able to do what they want, even if there are harms to the environment and other non-human species. And that's a thing that many philosophers thought for a very long time. So it's not exactly a niche view necessarily. OK, but I'll go back to my hidden agenda. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give some indication of the theories that are broadly reflected by these 4 answers. So the first one is drawing attention to value. It's drawing attention to the consequences of actions and whether the actions give you more value or less value. The second one is drawing attention to rules and laws, moral injunctions, we say, about what you can and can't do. The third is about motivations. It's about character. It's about virtues. And then the last one is quite straightforward. It's about the value of the environment. OK, so I'm going to quickly introduce these theories, or families of theories. Again, this is very fast, and hopefully it'll just sort of be reinforced as we go along. So the first family of theories we call consequentialism. And the most famous example of consequentialist theories is utilitarianism. You may have heard of that. You may not have heard of consequentialism. Consequentialism is the broad family. Utilitarian is the most influential part of it. And consequentialist theories say that the rightness of actions is determined by reference to the consequences of those actions, and only by reference to the consequences of those actions. So in the example, in the iClicker question, it was about value, but it might be other kinds of consequences as well. Now, I want to immediately trouble you about this theory, right? So, and I chose this image very specifically to do so. So one of the things about consequentialism is it says, well, we want to compare all of the costs and benefits, or the implications, the ways that the consequences of a particular action. And it might be that, environmentally speaking, if there is some sort of industrial activity, let's say, or maybe emissions that are environmentally destructive, they might be balanced off by enough of whatever else makes life worth living, whether that's pleasure or leisure or satisfaction. And so it might be that if there's enough of pleasure or leisure, which I'm representing here by these happy Venezuelan beachgoers, that could balance out the environmental harms. And a consequentialist should say, well, if there are enough benefits in the future, then they might do things that, they might justify things that you might think of as problematic. Please.
Does that have to mean that they're...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, wouldn't that have to mean that their leisure is a consequence of those power plants?
Yeah, no, so that's a very good question. So the question was, does it mean that the two have to be connected in the right way? That because of an action which involved these power plants, they got that leisure. And in the example I'm giving, yes, I'm assuming something like that they come as a package and they're not separable. That's probably not true in this picture, but this is supposed to be representative of a situation where you get the leisure or pleasure as a result of the, for example, the pollution. Okay, so the second set of answers was about rules that, like, you shouldn't kill other living beings. Here again, we determine the rightness of actions by reference to their conformance to or agreement with the laws or rules, often of reason. And a figure that you may have heard of is Kant, Immanuel Kant. He's very influential as a modern form of this set of theories. And you should immediately be thinking, okay, well, it seems right that we shouldn't kill other beings, but there are circumstances in which we can kill other beings, right? You should be able to kill at least in self-defense. You might also be able to kill if it's unavoidable for some reason. There might be ways that it's unavoidable, or maybe it's possible to just risk harming others. So immediately it looks much more complicated than a simple rule can govern. So the question for the deontologist is how to figure out exactly when we have a law or a rule. Because if you start adding all of the conditions onto them, then they look less and less like laws, and then it's harder and harder to see how they have the general force. So the difficulty for deontologists is to generate those rules, how we know them, and what gives them that rule status. And the third example I gave in the iClicker thing was it reveals something bad about them as a person. It reveals something about their motivations or their character. Now here's an example that's supposed to make that sound a little bit weird. So here in Xingtai, Xingtai is in northern China, and it's highly polluted. And so we have a coal worker, and there's many coal workers in this area of the world. And coal is extremely dangerous. It's bad for the workers. It's very dangerous for respiratory reasons. It's dangerous for the surrounding community. It's dangerous for the local wildlife. It's dangerous for the water. It's actually, and of course climate change, because coal is concentrated carbon. So that means that the whole nexus is threatened by coal mining. So you would think coal mining, if anything, is a bad thing, then mining coal would be one of them. But if we think about this coal miner, it's likely that it's much more difficult to read whether they're being virtuous or vicious off of their actions. So for example, it's likely that this coal miner has very few options for feeding their family. It's very likely, it's quite possible that this coal miner doesn't know about the potential health or climate risks that coal mining causes. And all of these things make it more difficult to know when someone is acting out of a virtue or a vice and when not. And that's one of the difficult questions for virtue ethics. Okay, so as I said, I'm giving you a bonus half a theory. Because we're in an environmental nexus course, one of the relevant things, and of course the thing that Routley wants us to move towards, is environmental ethics. And as the quite astute comment in the first row suggested, this is sort of half a theory in the sense that it's not a fully developed theory, and it also might be compatible with the others to greater or lesser degrees. So this theory says that living beings, maybe only living beings that are sentient, or maybe only any living being, or maybe even non-living beings, some environmental structures, are intrinsically valuable or morally considerable. Now, again, I want to push back on this. So the first question is, what would it take to be intrinsically valuable or morally considerable? What are the conditions that might need to be met in order to get that status? And this is really difficult for environmental ethicists. And I think it's fair to say since the 70s, when Routley sort of issued this call to arms, environmental ethicists have been working on this problem, and it's very difficult to get, let's say, complete, coherent, engaging answers. So let's move on to this a little bit. So we often think in terms of who is morally considerable in terms of spheres of concern. And broadly speaking, these have expanded over time. So we might have historically thought about small groups. And we might think now of larger groups. We might think of the state we live in. We might think of the country we live in. We might even think of all humans in a sort of a cosmopolitan way, thinking about the world as sets of individuals that we owe duties of justice to, regardless of where they live. But of course, we might go beyond that. We might go to other kinds of animals that are not human. We might go to other things that are not even living. Okay, so this idea should hopefully give you some thoughts already about where you think the spheres of concern might go, maybe even why. And so get your iClickers out because I'm going to ask you a question about this. So a question to vote on, are there good reasons to take only human beings to be considerable? Actually, wait, I'll stop it. I'll wait till I read it. Yes, because human beings have greater cognitive abilities. So they might have reasoning, language, memory. Yes, because we're human beings, so it's okay for us to take human beings as more valuable. No, because there's a broader variety of things that are morally considerable, all animals, and maybe even things that are all living things, or if you're extreme, maybe even things that are non-living. Okay, so now I'll pull it up. I'll just give you a few more seconds. Looks like we've got pretty much everyone already. All right. So again, we have a large number of. So I think we're getting the same what's what I'm looking for, phenomenon, I guess, that Steve got in the Steve Collis got in the first lecture. It seems like you're all a very green group in a certain way, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing. I think it's good to have very different views, but it seems like this is a pretty green group in that there is a broad variety of interests in terms of what you might think matters. So I'd be interested in hearing from someone in one of the others, 1, 2, or 3, A, B, or C. Does anyone want to put limits, please? Oh, maybe wait for the mic, sorry. Over the orange.
Okay, so I don't necessarily agree with it, but I put number 2 because I think it's fair to say that if maybe, we should consider animals and other living things, but at the same time, we're humans, we're the ones making the decision about what to care about. We wouldn't expect, a dog to care about the moral implications of the cat.
Good.
And I think human beings are the ones who are worried about morality, and so I think we could say that there is a good reason to only care about humans because we are humans.
That's great. And so we can go even further, right? The cat is going to care negatively about the mouse, right? They're really not going to, they're not only going to consider them not part of their moral community, they're going to consider them better when they're food. Anyone else? Please.
Yeah, I also picked 2, just because I was thinking about the question, like, in all honesty, like, if I could save either you guys or, like, the trees or something, I would save you guys. So...
Good. So she's calling all you liars. No. So yeah, I think that's true. It's good to be honest about where we care about, and we have limited concern. Our concern doesn't apply as broadly as maybe we think it should or could. So we have one. I'll give one more, and then we'll go. Yeah, one more in the front.
I just want to say that there was a fence between because if the wording of the question had been the good reasons to the word only was the pivot word. Because yes, I agree with you in the sense that like if I had to choose between the trees and this lecture hall, I would say people the lecture hall. But at the same time, saying to take only human beings to be morally considerable, that I don't agree with.
Well, the fact that you'd rather be in this lecture hall with me, I take as a profound compliment. So thank you. No, I think that's right. We have to think about the trade-offs. We have to think about how these different things are used and whether they're used in ways that may be valuable and might be valuable only to us. Obviously, other species don't care whether we're in this lecture hall right now or not in any obvious way. Okay, good. So I think I want to, since there was a couple of people talking about 2, I want to point out something that's really interesting about 2. You might think that there's, so again, Peter Singer, who works here who teaches moral philosophy in Princeton, has specifically responded to 2. And he thought that 2 is a problem in that it has the same structural reasoning as many things that we might disagree with. So here's how. So for many years, we've always thought about, for example, my race. That's a very hot button one. And if you thought about it, well, it's okay for me to privilege the interests of my race because it's my race. We would call that racist, or he suggested we would call that racist. Similarly, if we thought about it as our country and we said, I only consider the interests of my country, we might call that nationalist. Now, that may or may not be a good thing. But he suggested that that's the same sort of reasoning, and if you reject it in some cases, you should reject it in others. Again, that's an example of a philosopher taking a principle, seeing actually here he's taking an implication, and he's seeing which principle underlies it, and trying to cast doubt on that principle by seeing some of its implications as potentially objectionable. I'm not going to weigh in on that, but that's a structure of reasoning that might cast doubt, or Peter Singer thought cast doubt on this view. Okay, so almost done. I'm going to discuss a principle about number 1. Okay, so so this again is an example of a philosopher taking a principle and looking at the implications of it and considering how those implications play out and whether those implications are problematic. So here we have the cognitive capacities principle, and this was actually, historically speaking, what motivated most people to consider only humans. They thought human beings had special capacities, special abilities that no other animals shared. And to some extent, as we learn more about other species, we learn they have more capacities than we thought they did, and they have greater heterogeneity in their ways of living. But even given that, there are ways that humans are more extreme in many ways, and some of those are our cognitive capacities. So if we accept this principle, what are the implications? So many environmental ethicists have pointed out that some of the ways that these have implications are that it would imply that some groups that you might think are morally considerable would not end up being morally considerable. And in particular, if you think it requires cognitive capacities, then you might think that individuals that have not yet fully developed or not yet developed at all their cognitive capacities are less or not at all morally considerable. And that seems rejectable to many people. So someone thinks that, yeah, I don't know. Maybe some people might disagree. Again, I say this in these very, very low terms because you'll find a philosopher that disagrees with you, whatever you say out there. So we sort of couch things in the most minimal terms. Okay, so, and also you might think that it's important that we consider individuals that have permanent cognitive either disabilities or conditions that inhibit their cognitive capacities. Whatever your cognitive capacity that you're focusing on, there will be some individuals that are not able to exercise that for various reasons. And it seems like, it seems to many people, that this does not seem like a good reason to not include them in the morally considerable category. So again, what we see here is we see a theory, here's this principle, and we see these implications. And these implications, again, are supposed to be counterexamples. They're supposed to show us how the principle is giving the wrong implications. And if it's giving the wrong implications, that's reason to be suspicious of it or to consider it more carefully. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to say here is that when we're thinking about the role of these cognitive capacities, although they have been historically really influential, that's not to say that they're not actually represented in the animal kingdom. We do see that humans have abilities of abstract thought that seem to not be represented in the animal kingdom, or at least not to the same extent. So this is something that we see, although we can determine that various animals have more sophisticated language abilities than we might have historically thought. There are ways that this is, that there is some evidence basis for humans being unusual in these respects. Okay, so to wrap up, I wanted to say again what the learning goals are. So the first one was I wanted you to have a sense of what moral philosophers do. So what we do is we create these theories, we draw these implications, and on the basis of these theories plus these implications, we measure some theories against others. And we try to figure out which ones are going to be more plausible. And in particular, we do that by looking at the intuitions about our pre-theoretical judgments about what's the case and what we think our theory should predict. And if our theories and our implications have a good fit with these intuitions, then that tells us that in reflective equilibrium, they compare favorably or that they are strong. With the Routledge text, I wanted you to understand in practice how this looks. We have this principle of basic human chauvinism, and we have these implications for what would be permissible for the last people to do. And Routledge thinks that these implications are reasonably rejectable, and on that basis, he thinks that we should reject the basic human chauvinist idea. I gave you these three families of moral theories: consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics, and this extra sort of hybrid environmental ethics. And then I discussed a little bit about what it is to be morally considerable and several different criteria, and a couple of basic arguments about why something that might seem like a good reason to make human beings the only relevant part of our moral considerability, maybe why we should consider that more carefully. And one of them was from Singer, and this other one is from these marginal cases. So I think we can stop there, and thanks for your attention.